At exactly 2:17 a.m., the dog would wake up, not with a bark, not with fear, but as if something beneath the house had just called his name. Daniel Mercer noticed it on the third night, not the first, because the first 2 times he told himself it was just the wind pressing against the old wooden frame, just the kind of sound a forgotten house makes when it settles into silence. But Rex didn't believe that, and Rex had never been wrong before. The German Shepherd would rise slowly from the worn rug beside Daniel's bed, ears lifting toward the wall across the room, his body going still in that precise, controlled way he used to during their service years, as if he were listening not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something instinctive that Daniel had learned long ago not to question. "It's nothing, boy," Daniel murmured the first time he fully woke to it, his voice rough with sleep as he pushed himself up on one elbow, watching the faint outline of the dog against the dim blue glow of the digital clock. But Rex didn't turn, didn't relax, didn't even blink. He just stood there, staring at the same section of wall, as if time itself had paused behind it. The house, tucked deep in the northern woods miles from the nearest town, had been cheap, almost suspiciously so, the kind of place people passed over without asking too many questions, and Daniel had taken it without hesitation, because he wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for quiet, the kind of quiet that might finally let the past loosen its grip, the kind that didn't ask anything of him in return. Outside, the wind moved gently through the tall pines, carrying that faint metallic scent of cold earth and distant water, and inside, the air felt still enough to hold a memory in place. But then Rex let out a low, controlled breath, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, something in between, something that made Daniel sit up fully now, his heartbeat slowing into that familiar, measured rhythm he hadn't used since the days when silence meant paying attention or paying a price. "What is it?" he asked softly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, the wooden floor cool beneath his bare feet as he stepped closer, watching the dog's posture, the tension in his shoulders, the subtle shift of weight that said this wasn't curiosity, this was recognition. Rex took one step forward, then another, until he stood inches from the wall, his nose hovering just above the surface. And for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath, the wind outside, the ticking clock, even Daniel himself, as if the world were waiting for something to happen. But nothing did, not yet, and after a long minute, Rex finally exhaled, the tension easing just enough for him to turn his head slightly, glancing back at Daniel with those amber eyes that always seemed to know more than they revealed. "Yeah," Daniel whispered, running a hand along the back of his neck, trying to shake the feeling creeping in under his skin. "I hear it too." But that wasn't true, not yet, because whatever Rex was sensing hadn't reached him, not in sound, not in vibration, not in anything he could name. And still, something about the air had changed, something subtle, something quiet, something that didn't belong to an empty house. The next morning, Daniel tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the dog adjusting to a new place, to old instincts looking for patterns that weren't there. But when he stepped into the kitchen, Rex was already sitting near that same wall, perfectly still, ears forward, waiting, and when their eyes met, Daniel felt it again, that unspoken understanding, that silent agreement they had carried through years of uncertainty. Rex wasn't guessing. He was listening. And whatever was on the other side of that wall, it wasn't finished speaking yet. By the second night, Daniel stopped telling himself it was nothing, because patterns like that did not come from nowhere, and Rex had begun to follow it with a precision that made the air inside the house feel tighter, more deliberate, as if something unseen had drawn a quiet line through their lives and was waiting for them to notice. It started again at exactly 2:17 a.m., not a second earlier, not a second later, and this time Daniel was already awake, lying still in the darkness with his eyes fixed on the faint outline of the wall, listening for anything that might explain what the dog seemed to hear so clearly. But there was only silence, deep and unbroken, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you begin to wonder if you have forgotten how to listen. Rex rose the same way as before, slow and controlled, his paws making almost no sound against the floor as he moved forward, every step measured, every breath steady, until he reached the same spot and stopped, his ears lifting, his head tilting just slightly, as if aligning himself with something precise, something that did not exist for human senses. Daniel pushed himself up again, this time already alert, already focused, his mind slipping into an old rhythm he had not used in years, counting the seconds between his own breaths, between the faint creaks of the house, between the distant whisper of wind moving through the trees outside. 1, 2, 3. He waited, and for a moment, nothing happened, and then, just as he was about to exhale, he felt it, not a sound, not exactly, but a sensation, a faint tremor under the floorboards, so light it might have been imagined, except it came again, and this time it carried a pattern. Daniel froze, his gaze shifting slowly toward Rex, whose body had gone rigid, his tail low, his focus absolute, and suddenly the room did not feel empty anymore. The tremor came back, subtle but steady, like a pulse hidden deep within the structure of the house, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but recognition, the kind that does not ask permission before it arrives. He moved closer to the wall, lowering himself until his hand rested flat against the surface, the wood cool beneath his palm, and he held it there, waiting, counting again, letting his training guide him through the quiet. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 20, and just when he thought he had lost it, there it was again, a soft, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the wall and into his bones before fading back into stillness. "You hear that, do you not?" he whispered, his voice barely more than breath, and Rex responded with a low sound deep in his chest, not a warning, but confirmation. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, letting the pattern settle into his mind, mapping it the way he once mapped signals in places where every second mattered, and the realization came slowly, but when it did, it stayed. This was not random. This was not the house settling. This was not wind. This was something repeating, something measured, something that existed whether he noticed it or not. He opened his eyes and looked at the wall again, really looked this time, noticing the slight discoloration in the wood, the almost invisible seam running vertically from floor to ceiling, the kind of detail most people would miss unless they were searching for it. Rex stepped forward and placed his nose against that exact line, then lifted one paw and pressed it gently against the wall, holding it there as if marking the place. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind no longer trying to dismiss what was happening, because whatever lay behind that wall had a rhythm, and whatever had a rhythm had a purpose. And if Rex had been listening to it all along, then maybe the real question was not why the dog could hear it, but why it had waited until now for Daniel to finally listen to. Daniel did not sleep after that, not really, because once a pattern reveals itself, it has a way of settling into the mind, repeating quietly beneath every thought until it demands to be understood, and by the time the first gray light of morning filtered through the narrow windows, he was already standing in front of the wall again, coffee untouched on the counter behind him, his attention fixed on that faint seam running through the wood like a line someone had tried to hide, but never fully erased. Rex sat a few feet away, perfectly still, watching Daniel now instead of the wall, as if the responsibility had shifted, as if the dog had done his part and was waiting for the man to follow through. Daniel ran his fingers slowly along the surface, feeling for inconsistencies, for anything that might confirm what he already suspected, and there it was, a slight change in texture where the boards met, subtle enough to escape notice, but deliberate enough to suggest intention. "This was not built like the rest of the house," he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog, his voice carrying that calm, measured tone he used when assembling a problem piece by piece. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, brushing against the walls with a soft, steady rhythm, but it did not match what he had felt during the night, that deeper, more precise pulse that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the surface. He stepped back, scanning the room, letting his eyes adjust to the details he had ignored before, the way the furniture sat just slightly off from center, the way the rug did not quite align with the floorboards, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached down and pulled it aside. Dust rose in a thin cloud, catching the morning light as it drifted upward, revealing the bare wood beneath, and for a moment, everything looked ordinary, just another worn section of floor in an aging house, until Rex stood and moved forward, his paws landing with quiet certainty as he stepped directly onto a spot near the base of the wall and stopped. Daniel watched him, his breath slowing, his focus narrowing, and then he saw it, a faint outline etched into the wood, a rectangular shape no more than 3 feet wide and maybe 5 feet long, its edges softened by time, but still present if you knew where to look. He crouched down, brushing his hand across the surface, and the difference was unmistakable now. This section had been placed, not built, set into position with care, and then covered over as if meant to disappear. Rex lowered his head, pressing his nose against one corner, then lifted his paw and tapped the same spot twice, a deliberate motion that sent a quiet echo through the floor, and Daniel felt it again, that faint vibration, weaker now in daylight, but still there, still steady, still waiting. "All right," he murmured, his voice steady but low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever lay beyond, and he rose to his feet, moving toward the small tool chest near the kitchen, his mind already working through the possibilities, the measurements, the structure of the house as he had come to understand it over the past few days. When he returned, he carried a simple pry bar and a flashlight. Nothing more, nothing dramatic, just the kind of tools a man uses when he is not looking for trouble, only for truth. He knelt beside the outline again, placing the edge of the bar carefully along the seam, testing the resistance, feeling the give of the wood beneath his hands, and for a moment, he paused, glancing once toward Rex, whose gaze remained fixed on him, steady and unwavering. There was no fear in the dog's eyes, only expectation, and that alone told Daniel everything he needed to know. He took a slow breath, pressed down gently, and felt the first subtle shift as the hidden panel began to loosen, the sound soft, almost respectful, like something long forgotten finally being asked to speak again. The panel did not open all at once. It shifted in small increments, resisting just enough to remind him that it had not been touched in a very long time. And as Daniel applied steady pressure with the pry bar, the wood lifted with a low, muted sound that seemed to settle into the room rather than echo through it, like the house itself was absorbing the moment. Rex stepped back slightly, not out of fear but out of awareness, his ears still forward, his body angled toward the opening as if he already understood what was coming next. When the panel finally gave way, Daniel set the tool aside and used both hands to lift it fully, revealing a dark space beneath the floor, a narrow opening that dropped down just a few feet before disappearing into shadow. Cool air drifted up from below, carrying a faint scent of stone and something older, something that had been sealed away long enough to forget the surface existed. Daniel reached for the flashlight and switched it on, the beam cutting cleanly through the darkness, revealing the first few details slowly, carefully, like a picture developing in stages. There was a ladder, simple and sturdy, built into the side of the opening, its wood worn smooth but still solid, leading down into a space that extended farther than the light could immediately reach. The walls below were not finished like the rest of the house. They were rough, natural, the kind of stone you do not shape but work around, suggesting that whatever lay beneath had been there long before the house was built above it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, angling the light deeper, and that was when he saw it, not clearly at first, just the outline of something positioned against the far wall, something rectangular, something that did not belong to the natural shape of the space. Behind him, Rex let out a soft exhale, almost like a quiet acknowledgement, and Daniel felt that same subtle vibration again, stronger now, more defined, rising up through the ladder, through the edges of the opening, into the floor where he knelt. It was steady, precise, repeating with a rhythm that no longer felt distant but close, present, undeniable. He checked his watch without thinking, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked the seconds, and there it was again, right on time. The faint pulse traveling through the structure in a pattern too exact to ignore. Every 27 seconds, he said under his breath, the number settling into place with a weight he could not quite explain, and for a brief moment, a memory brushed against the edge of his mind, something from years ago, something he had not thought about in a long time, but it faded before he could fully grasp it. Rex moved closer again, stopping at the edge of the opening, peering down without hesitation, his posture calm, alert, ready, and Daniel studied him for a second, looking for any sign of uncertainty, any signal that this was something to avoid, but there was none. The dog was not warning him away. He was waiting for him to continue. Daniel adjusted his grip on the flashlight, then shifted his weight forward, placing one foot carefully onto the first rung of the ladder, testing it before committing his balance, and when it held, he followed with the other, descending slowly, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. The air grew cooler as he went down, the light from above narrowing into a soft frame around the opening, until it became just another shape above him, distant and quiet. When his boots finally reached the ground, the sound was solid, grounded, and he paused there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting the beam of the flashlight sweep across the space in front of him. The room was larger than he expected, maybe 12 feet across, with a low ceiling supported by rough beams, and along one side sat a single object, covered in a thin layer of dust, but unmistakably placed, deliberate, waiting. Daniel took a slow step forward, the vibration rising again beneath his feet, stronger now, more insistent, and he realized then that whatever was creating that rhythm was not behind the wall anymore. It was down here, with him, still repeating, still counting, still holding on to something that had not yet been finished. The object against the far wall did not reveal itself all at once. It waited, just like the rhythm beneath his feet, as if it had learned patience from the years it had spent in silence. And Daniel moved toward it slowly, the beam of his flashlight steady but cautious, sweeping across the uneven ground until it settled fully on the shape. It was a box, about 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, built from thick metal panels dulled by time. Its surface marked with faint scratches and edges worn just enough to suggest it had once been handled often, carefully, with purpose. It did not belong to the house above, that much was clear, and it did not belong to the natural stone around it either. It had been brought here, placed here, left here. The vibration pulsed again, stronger now, and Daniel felt it rise through the soles of his boots, up through his legs, settling somewhere deep in his chest, and without thinking, he began counting again, letting the rhythm guide him, letting it anchor him the way it used to when everything depended on recognizing a pattern before it was too late. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 27, and there it was again, steady, precise, unchanging. He crouched down beside the box, lowering the flashlight until the light caught along its edges, revealing a small panel on one side, not locked, not sealed, just closed, as if whoever had left it here had intended for it to be opened when the time was right. Rex's paws sounded softly on the ladder behind him, then on the ground as the dog joined him without hesitation, moving forward until he stood beside Daniel, his head level with the top of the box, his gaze fixed on it with quiet intensity. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, only that same steady awareness, and Daniel reached out slowly, resting his hand against the cool surface of the metal. It was colder than the surrounding air, almost as if it held its own temperature, separate from the room. And for a moment, he hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because something about this felt deliberate, like a message waiting to be understood rather than simply uncovered. "All right," he said softly, more to the moment than to the dog, and he shifted his hand to the edge of the panel, applying gentle pressure. The lid lifted with a quiet, controlled motion, no resistance, no sudden movement, just a smooth opening that revealed the contents inside. The light from the flashlight fell across a compact device, neatly secured within the box, its shape familiar in a way that tightened something deep in Daniel's chest before he could fully understand why. It was not large, maybe the size of a small case, with a simple interface on the front, a single indicator light glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the vibration he had been feeling since the night before. The realization came slowly, but once it settled, it did not leave. This was the source. Not the house, not the walls, not the ground itself. This. Rex leaned in slightly, his nose hovering just above the device, his ears forward, listening, always listening, and Daniel felt a memory begin to surface again, clearer this time, sharper, something from another place, another time, when he had waited in silence for a signal that never came in time. His hand hovered over the device, not touching it yet, just feeling the rhythm, watching the faint glow rise and fall in perfect intervals, and for the first time since stepping into the house, he understood that this was not just something hidden. It was something still active, still working, still sending out a signal that no one had answered. Until now. Daniel did not touch the device right away because something about the steady pulse of its light held him in place, not out of fear, but out of respect for what it represented. And as he crouched there in the dim underground room, the past finally stopped hovering at the edges of his memory and stepped forward in full. The rhythm, the exact interval, the quiet persistence of the signal, it all aligned with something he had carried for years, something unfinished, something that had never fully settled. He exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the soft glow rising and falling in front of him, and for a moment, the small room beneath the house no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like a continuation. Rex shifted beside him, lowering himself onto the ground with a calm, deliberate motion, his head resting just inches from the box, his breathing slow and even, as if he had already accepted what this place meant before Daniel had the words for it. "You found it," Daniel whispered, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement, and Rex's ears flicked slightly in response, his gaze never leaving the device. The air down here felt different now, not just cool and still, but charged in a subtle way, as if the space itself had been waiting for recognition, for someone to understand what it had been holding on to all this time. Daniel reached out again, this time letting his fingers rest gently against the side of the device, feeling the faint vibration directly through the metal, and it was unmistakable now, not just a pattern, but a signal designed to be noticed, to be followed, to be answered. His mind moved through the possibilities, the purpose behind something like this, the kind of equipment that would continue operating for years without interruption, and one thought settled more firmly than the rest. This had been left intentionally, not abandoned, not forgotten. Left. The difference mattered. He shifted his hand to the front of the device, brushing away a thin layer of dust until the surface beneath became clearer, revealing faint markings etched into the metal, numbers worn but still legible, coordinates perhaps, or an identification code, something meant for someone who knew how to read it. Daniel leaned closer, angling the flashlight until the light traced over the markings, and as he studied them, the pieces began to align in a way that made his chest tighten, not with fear, but with something quieter, something heavier. This was not random. This was not chance. The house, the hidden panel, the signal repeating every 27 seconds, it all pointed to a single truth he could no longer ignore. Someone had set this in motion knowing that eventually, someone like him would find it. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears turning toward the device as the pulse continued, steady and patient, and Daniel followed the motion instinctively, his attention returning to the soft glow, to the quiet persistence of something that had never stopped doing exactly what it was meant to do. All this time, he murmured, his voice low, almost lost in the stillness. It just kept going. He sat back on his heels for a moment, letting the weight of that settle, letting the silence around him deepen, and then slowly, deliberately, he reached for the edge of the device again, this time searching not just for what it was, but for what it might lead to. Because signals like this were never the end of a story. They were the beginning of something waiting to be found, something waiting to be understood. And now that he was finally listening, Daniel realized that whatever this was, it had not been calling out into the dark at all. It had been calling to someone who would recognize the pattern, someone who would not walk away, someone who would follow it wherever it led. And whether he had been looking for it or not, that someone had become him. Daniel stayed there longer than he realized, the quiet pulse of the device filling the underground room with a rhythm that no longer felt foreign. And as he studied the faint markings more closely, his fingers tracing over the worn engravings, a subtle shift in perspective began to take hold, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like the signal itself guiding him toward understanding. The numbers etched into the metal were not random. They followed a structure, a sequence that his mind recognized before he consciously acknowledged it. And when he angled the flashlight just right, the final line became clear enough to read fully. Coordinates. Not just any coordinates, but ones that aligned with a region he had not thought about in years, a place tied to a mission long buried beneath time and distance. His breath slowed as the realization settled deeper, connecting the rhythm, the device, the hidden chamber, all to something that had once been part of his world, something that had never truly been resolved. Rex shifted beside him again, lifting his head slightly, as if sensing the change, the quiet moment when confusion turns into direction, and Daniel glanced at him, seeing that same steady presence reflected back, the same unspoken understanding that had carried them through countless uncertain moments before. "You knew this was more than just a sound," Daniel said softly, and Rex blinked once, calm and certain, as if the answer had never been in doubt. The device pulsed again, steady as ever, and Daniel leaned forward, examining its surface more carefully, noticing now a small latch along the side he had not opened yet, subtle and nearly invisible unless you were searching for it. He hesitated only briefly before sliding it open, revealing a narrow compartment inside, and within it, a folded piece of paper, preserved carefully despite the years. He removed it slowly, unfolding it with measured precision, and the sound of the paper moving in the quiet room seemed louder than it should have been, as if it carried more weight than its size suggested. The handwriting inside was firm but slightly faded, the kind of writing that had been done with purpose, meant to be read clearly even after time had passed, and as Daniel's eyes moved across the lines, something in his chest tightened, not with pain, but with recognition. The message was not long, just a few sentences, but each word felt deliberate, chosen, as if written by someone who understood exactly who might one day read it. It spoke of a signal left behind, of a place not meant to be forgotten, of something waiting beyond what could be seen on the surface, and at the end, a single line stood apart from the rest, simple and unmistakable. If you are reading this, then you are the one who finally listened. Daniel lowered the paper slightly, the words echoing in the quiet space, and for a moment, the room seemed to shift, not physically, but in meaning, as if everything around him had just revealed its purpose all at once. Rex let out a soft breath, his tail brushing lightly against the ground, and Daniel folded the paper carefully, holding it in his hand as he looked back at the device, at the steady light that had never stopped, not once, not in all the time it had been waiting. The coordinates, the message, the signal, they were not separate pieces, they were a path, one that extended beyond this room, beyond this house, leading somewhere else entirely. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze steady now, no longer searching for answers, but beginning to understand the direction they pointed. Whatever had been left here was never meant to stay hidden forever. It was meant to be found by someone who would not ignore it, someone who would follow it, someone who would finish what had been left incomplete. And standing there in the quiet underground room, with Rex beside him and the steady pulse continuing beneath his hand, Daniel realized that the story he thought he had left behind had just found its way back to him, not by chance, but by design. Daniel read the coordinates again, slower this time, letting each number settle into place, not just as directions on a map, but as something more deliberate, something that connected the quiet room beneath his feet to a place far beyond the walls of this house. And as he stood there with the folded note in his hand, the steady pulse of the device continued without interruption, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, the moment when understanding finally caught up with intention. Rex rose to his feet beside him, his body shifting with quiet readiness, his ears angled forward not toward the device now, but toward Daniel, as if the focus had changed, as if the signal had done its job and passed the next step to him. Daniel exhaled slowly, slipping the note carefully into his jacket pocket, his fingers pressing against it for just a second longer than necessary, grounding himself in the reality of what he had found, and then he reached out once more to the device, not to stop it, not to question it, but to acknowledge it. "You kept going," he said under his breath, his voice steady, almost calm, and there was something about saying it out loud that made the space feel less empty, less like a hidden place, and more like a message finally received. He looked around the room one more time, letting the light sweep across the rough stone walls, the beams overhead, the quiet corners that had held this secret for so long, and then he turned back toward the ladder. Rex moved first this time, stepping toward the base without hesitation, pausing only long enough to glance back as if to confirm Daniel was following, and together they began to climb, the narrow opening above growing brighter with each step until the cool underground air gave way to the softer light of the house above. When Daniel pulled himself back onto the floor, the room felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because now he understood that the house was not just a place to stay. It was a point along a path that had been set long before he arrived. He replaced the panel carefully, lowering it back into position with the same deliberate control he had used to open it, then slid the rug back over the surface, restoring the appearance of stillness, but the stillness no longer held the same meaning it once had. Rex stood nearby, watching, his posture relaxed but attentive, and when Daniel finally straightened up, their eyes met for a brief moment that carried more understanding than words ever could. "We are not staying here much longer, are we?" Daniel said quietly, and Rex's tail gave a single slow movement, not excitement, not hesitation, just agreement. Outside, the wind had softened, moving gently through the trees with a steady rhythm that now felt almost familiar, echoing something deeper, something he could not quite name but no longer ignored. Daniel walked to the window, looking out over the stretch of land beyond the house, the distant line of forest fading into the horizon, and for the first time since arriving, his mind was not searching for quiet, it was following direction. The coordinates in his pocket were not just numbers anymore, they were a destination, a continuation, something that had been waiting just beyond the reach of his attention until now. Behind him, Rex moved closer, his presence steady and grounding, and Daniel rested a hand briefly against the dog's back, feeling the quiet strength there, the same instinct that had led them here without hesitation. "You heard it first," he murmured, his voice low, almost reflective, and Rex leaned slightly into the touch, as if acknowledging the truth of it. The signal still pulsed below the floor, unseen now, unheard by most, but no longer unanswered, and as Daniel stood there in the soft light of the room, he understood something that had taken him years to accept. Some things are not meant to fade. Some signals are not meant to end. They are meant to be followed, carried forward, completed. And whether he had been ready for it or not, the path ahead had already begun. They left before the next night could come, not in a rush, not in panic, but with the kind of quiet certainty that does not need to be explained, because once a direction becomes clear, staying still begins to feel like the only wrong choice. The morning air carried a crisp edge as Daniel loaded the truck. The sky stretched wide above the tree line, pale blue with thin streaks of cloud drifting slowly east, and the house behind him stood unchanged, still and silent, as if it had already given everything it was meant to give. Rex moved around the yard with calm purpose, not restless, not anxious, just aware, his ears lifting occasionally toward the distant woods as if tracking something far beyond what the eye could see. Daniel paused for a moment at the edge of the porch, his hand resting lightly against the worn wood of the railing, and he let himself take in the stillness one last time, not as an escape, but as a memory, something that had served its purpose and now belonged to the past. Inside, beneath the floor, the signal would still be pulsing, steady as ever, counting out its quiet rhythm, but it no longer needed to be heard there, because its meaning had already moved with him. He stepped down into the yard and walked toward the truck, the gravel shifting softly under his boots, and Rex fell into step beside him without a word, without hesitation, as if the path ahead had always been understood between them. The drive began slowly, the narrow road winding through the trees, sunlight breaking through in scattered patches that flickered across the windshield, and for a while, neither of them moved beyond the simple act of leaving, the quiet transition from one place to another. Daniel kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the folded note in his jacket pocket, and every so often, his fingers would press lightly against it, not to check if it was still there, but to remind himself that what had happened was real, that the signal had been found, that the next step was not imagined. Hours passed, the forest thinning into open land, the horizon widening, and eventually, he pulled over along a quiet stretch of road, cutting the engine and letting the silence settle in around them again. Rex shifted in his seat, turning his head toward Daniel, his gaze steady and calm, and for a moment, they simply sat there, the world open in front of them, the past no longer pressing from behind. Daniel reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper once more, reading the final line again, slower now, letting it settle differently than before, not as a message waiting to be understood, but as something already fulfilled. If you are reading this, then you are the one who finally listened. He looked up, his eyes tracing the line where the sky met the land, and something inside him, something that had carried weight for years, shifted just enough to let in a different kind of quiet, not empty, not heavy, but complete in a way he had not expected. Rex leaned slightly toward him, resting his head against Daniel's arm, and the simple gesture grounded the moment, made it real in a way nothing else could. Daniel exhaled slowly, folding the paper again, and placing it back into his pocket, his hand lingering there for just a second before returning to the wheel. "We are not done yet," he said softly, his voice steady, not uncertain, not searching, just aware, and Rex's tail moved once, a slow, deliberate motion that carried its own kind of answer. The road ahead stretched forward, quiet and open, and as the engine started again and the truck eased back into motion, Daniel did not look back at the place they had left behind, because he understood now that some stories do not end where they begin, and some signals are not meant to be silenced. They are meant to be carried, followed, and finished by those who choose to listen. And sometimes, the ones who hear them first are not the ones who speak, but the ones who stay long enough to understand.